What makes our store distinctive is probably the books that we carry. It's a different selection than a typical bookstore. That's changed over the years. When we first opened, we were almost exclusively used and out of print books and collectible rare books to some extent. At that time, in 1989, even in Atlanta, there were probably 4 or 5 other very good antiquarian bookstores. Our selection was different from theirs in that it reflected our neighborhood and was a little more counterculture oriented, and I think we brought with us a perspective from our days in San Francisco and our sense of the importance of the Beat generation. Nowadays, we have really drifted more into new current books along with older and out-of-print books. But even within our new selection of books, we try to have a more distinctive selection of things that are current, but that might not be the most obvious books that are out there. We do carry bestsellers, but even within the bestseller list, we tend to lean, we think, towards the more distinctive titles that you'll find there. We've certainly had our share of famous people come in A Cappella Books over the years. Bruce Springsteen coming in one evening when he was in town recording an album was probably the biggest celebrity that came in, but we've had our share. Patti Smith has shopped in our store when she was performing in the neighborhood. Our store used to be right up the street from the Variety Playhouse, and so a lot of the performers who would play there, from Richard Thompson and Steve Earle, a lot of other folks would stop in when they were in the neighborhood. We have done our share of book signings with real prominent authors, and have had great times with Al Franken. Was probably a big highlight to host a reading with Al Franken, and also he recorded his radio show with an event we planned for and down at the Variety Playhouse in the neighborhood. That was very exciting for me. In the store, there's all sorts of funny incidents that happen just because a lot of characters have come through. After I opened the store in '89, I finally needed some help by about the middle of 1990, and I called an old friend of mine who had actually worked for me in San Francisco, and he and I had played some music together. And when he came to Atlanta and worked for me here, he started playing around on his own to some clubs. And he left after about a year, went back to San Francisco and embarked on a recording career, and has been fairly successful and somewhat well-known, Richard Buckner. And yeah, we've always had interesting people work here. Currently, most everybody on our staff now has master's degrees in English, and one of them did his master's thesis on Bob Dylan, and so the day he came in and asked for a job and told me that, I hired him on the spot. And Glenn Thrasher, who's worked for me for years, before he worked for me, published his own zine, mainly focused on punk rock, and it in the underground. It's a very well-known piece from the period. Low Life was the name of it. Chantal James, who currently works for us, she's a Fulbright Fellow. She spent a year in Morocco and got a novel at an agent that she's trying to sell, and she's leaving us for a little bit for a writer's workshop soon to work on another project she's got. So I did once have an employee leave, my employee, to go join the circus, and I thought that was that says a lot about the nature of the folks who have worked here over the years. When I first got married, almost 20 years ago, my wife is a lawyer, and most of her friends are lawyers or professionals, and they all had this very romantic sense of what it must be like to run a bookstore, and I bet that's the best thing. And I would always tell them, it's hard work, it's not much money. I love it, you might love it, but most people really wouldn't love it. Nowadays, fewer people come to me saying, gosh, I wish I could own a bookstore. But the ones who do, I honestly say, I would advise against it. I don't think that it's a very promising career to get started in at this juncture. If you're already in it, like I am, and the people who work for me are, I think there's a future. I think we can continue carving out an existence and playing some role. To start out now, I think would be a very unwise business move. If you're in it, my best advice, if you're in it, you probably don't need my advice. You've probably figured out your own answers. But what I think is, we can't compete. An independent small bookstore can't hope to compete with Amazon on selection or price. And Barnes and Noble and Borders, the jury's still out whether or not they can continue to even have the big stores that they have. Real estate is so expensive that I just wonder if these big box bookstores are really going to be around for much longer. I kind of doubt they will be. But the Amazons and online book selling is here to stay, and a store like this can't compete. So it's just a losing battle if you're going to try to outdo Amazon or do what Amazon does somehow better. You've got to do something different. And in our case, it's the distinct selection of books we have, and that's all a product of our experience and knowledge and understanding of who shops here and what kind of books they want. That's going to be different for other neighborhoods. I think specialty area stores can do well still. I think children's bookstores, we don't even carry children's books, but I think children's bookstores are doing better than most independents because they really get their audience, and you can't have the same experience on Amazon or Barnes & Noble of having story time and that kind of thing that kids' bookstores can do. I think specialty areas of expertise stores can still do well because people value having somebody who really knows an area, a specialty. So, but a small independent general interest bookstore, if you're not already established and have your clientele and neighborhood that appreciates you, I would advise on doing something else. When I started working in a used bookstore, antiquarian bookstore in San Francisco, I was about 20 years old. I shouldn't even say always. I'd read, I was a reader, but I wouldn't have called myself a book person. And I really, to this day, run into a lot of people who both have worked for me, who shop at my store, who really, I think, have read more than I have read because my youth was not spent devouring books, and most of my adult life has been spent trying to maintain the bookstore, so I still don't get the chance to read as many books as people assume I do. But I do love books in a lot of ways. But I think more than anything, the career that I've wound up with has shaped me as being somebody who really appreciates people whose lives are all about books and the passions that come with that. And so I view myself as somebody in supporting, enabling people to live out their passions. My own passions as far as books go are relatively few, but I usually tell people my favorite writers are Philip Roth, Flannery O'Connor, and Nathaniel West. And I'm a big fan of Charles Portis, who most people don't know who that is, but hopefully more people will. His most famous book was True Grit, which was made into a popular John Wayne movie in the 60s and is about to be made into a Coen Brothers movie this year. And I think my guess is the Coen Brothers will bring more attention to Charles Portis. He's a wonderfully comic writer. True Grit is a funny book in addition to being a very good book. And he wrote just a handful of other books that I love, and I've always tried to persuade people to buy them and read them and enjoy them. And I hope this movie will turn more people onto him. I have two daughters who, neither of whom really cares to read that much, but they they read what they have to read, and they kind of think it's funny that their dad is this book guy. And my wife, who's a lawyer, is actually probably a more voracious reader than I am. She reads a lot of fiction. I tend to, these days, read nonfiction. And I think most people agree, men, especially as they get older, tend to read more nonfiction than fiction, and that's true in my case. I love reading history and learning things I didn't know before. My degree actually in college is in Latin, and so classical culture, ancient culture is always of interest to me.